When I stayed at my mom's house for deer hunting last fall, I forgot to bring a book along. I'm rarely without reading material. So I went and looked at her bookcase. And I found these books. Let's see, get them right side up here. Some old dusty books that I had when I was a kid. I remembered reading them when I was about 6 or 7 years old. My dad had bought these books from the local country school when it stopped operating. And he bought them at the auction sale. So that dates me a little bit here. For one thing, I went to kindergarten in that one-room country schoolhouse the year before it closed down. And I remember reading them 50 years ago, and I didn't know that they were part of any sort of book series. The concept of a book series was completely foreign to me. I also took me a while to realize that the Laura that was referred to in third person in the books was actually the author as well. We had those two books at home, and later on I filled in the gaps with the other books in the library. Now, why would a boy read these books, sometimes considered girls' books, and why would a grown man still be interested in them? Well, I really just loved books in general. I loved the books and the stories. They told about pioneer life. They told about log cabins and covered wagons and bears and panthers and wagon loads full of big fish out of Lake Pepin and maple syruping and blizzards and prairie fires and things. I recently bought the whole set for my little granddaughter. I figure that a girl in 2021 growing up with the internet and cell phones and electricity and all the conveniences that we have should maybe learn about what it was like before people had all those things or could even imagine those things. When people cooked over wood stoves and the latest technology was the steam engine. I also found this book on Amazon while I was looking there, which is the story of the real Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote her autobiography. And this book just documents all of the real life people and events that are in the Little House books. Today, I'd like to tell you just briefly about the life of Laura Ingalls Wilder, run through the names of the books and their settings, and then talk about the comparison between the books and the real life Laura. First of all, a little timeline of Laura's life. She was born in Pepin, Wisconsin, which isn't too far away. All of us live fairly close to some of these events in these books. She married her husband in South Dakota in 1885. And in 1890, they briefly lived in Spring Valley. Basically, they were broke and they moved in with his parents. I always wondered why there were all these references to Spring Valley and Laura Ingalls Wilder in the area. I didn't know that there was a connection at all, but her husband's family had actually settled in Spring Valley when they moved out west from New York. So they stayed with his parents for a while. Then they moved to Missouri shortly afterwards. She started writing later on and just writing local columns for the local paper. And she didn't actually write her autobiography until 1930. So she was 60 years old before she even really started writing this, and didn't publish her first book until she was 65 years old. Rick, there's still hope for us. And Laura ultimately died in 1957. Now, generations of readers have enjoyed these books, but her original manuscript didn't sell. She couldn't sell it to the adult audience, so she changed it into children's literature. And in 1954, the American Library Association established the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award for authors that contributed significantly to children's literature. And they gave her the first medal. Now, as an amateur writer myself, I respect her perseverance in getting her works published. Let's look through the major, and again, the timeline for the books, though, was between when she was born and when she got married. So that's when all of those Little House books occurred. Let's look through some of the major locations and the books. As I mentioned, things sort of started in Pepin, Wisconsin. We'll see her go through Kansas, Minnesota, and South Dakota as we go. But in Pepin, Wisconsin, that's the setting for the little house in the big woods. These are all replicas of the cabins and things. And I've actually never visited these places. It's, again, one of those things that's in my backyard and I just never have done. But this is where she writes about living in a log cabin, maple syruping, experiences with bears and panthers and other things. The family in the books then moves to Kansas, where they lived in another log cabin. This is the real little house on the prairie, as far as the book is concerned. The next book is On the Banks of Plum Creek, set in southwestern Minnesota, not too far from where I grew up. And on the banks of Plum Creek, the family lived in a dugout house, which is just dug into a creek bank, covered up with poles and covered with sod. Not a very big place. You can kind of see just the outline of where it was. Walnut Grove was also the setting for the TV series that came out of the Little House books called Little House on the Prairie. I was always kind of amused when they would show scenes of Charles Ingalls riding his horse with mountains in the background. Whoever wrote that episode had not been to Minnesota. Later on, the books were set out in South Dakota by the shores of Silver Lake. She writes about mosquito problems here. I can't imagine why. And two books were set in the town of De Smet, which was The Long Winter and Little Town on the Prairie. Again, a very hospitable looking landscape there. And speaking of hospitable landscapes, Tim is from South Dakota. And doesn't this look like a great place to settle as a newlywed? But this is in the last book where she had married Almanzo. Where's my mouse? There we go. That's kind of the story of the books, but let's look at the comparison of how she traveled in those books. In the books, Laura and her family went from Pepin, Wisconsin, down to Independence, Kansas, or near there. They settled briefly. Things didn't work out very well. And the person who had bought the farm back in Pepin, Wisconsin, well, let me go, that's getting ahead of the game here. In the books, they moved from the little house on the prairie up to Walnut Grove into that dugout on the banks of Plum Creek. Then later on moved out to De Smet. That's the way it happened in the books. In real life, let's look at what happened. They went from Pepin, Wisconsin, down to Kansas. Again, things didn't work out there. The guy that had bought their farm back in Wisconsin stopped making payments. So they went back to Pepin, Wisconsin, farmed for a couple more years, lost some more money, then decided to go out to Walnut Grove. Again, that TV series set over there. They lived in Walnut Grove for a couple of years, but they lost 2 crops to grasshoppers. Things didn't work out, so they decided to move back east. This is kind of where it gets close to home because they moved actually to near South Troy, Minnesota. I live about a mile from South Troy out in the country. So this is in my backyard again. And they lived with Laura's uncle, Charles' brother, Peter Ingalls over there by South Troy. Charles got a job down in Burr Oak, Iowa. Again, I wondered why there were references to the Wilders down there. And ultimately, that job didn't work out as a hotel manager, so they moved back out to Walnut Grove, where he worked as a carpenter and as a storekeeper and ran a butcher shop. Later on, he was offered a job with the railroad, so they moved out with the railroad to De Smet, South Dakota, which wasn't even a town at the time. It was the camp at the end of the tracks. And that's where the rest of the books occurred there. Of course, in the books, Laura simplified the story, partly for children's literature to keep it simple, partly to give that story of perseverance and always moving west. She left out all the details about all the setbacks and all of the complications that came in real life. I tend to be more motivated by this story of the real Ingalls family. Charles took many different jobs, did whatever he could to support his family, even though really what he wanted to do was keep moving west all the way to Oregon and California. In conclusion, the Little House books were popular with young readers and gave us an idea of pioneer life. I remember being impressed with the resourcefulness of the Ingalls family. They could get by on so little. Now I ask you, can you imagine living in a 10 by 8 dugout house with 5 people? They lived mostly on cornbread, and they had really bad cell phone coverage. Little House books are stories of courage and perseverance. I recommend that you read them or reread them. I enjoyed them as a kid, and now I get to read them to my granddaughters. They can pretend that they're pioneer girls. Mr. Toastmaster.